Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to pick right back up where we last left off with our Cold War analysis. So in our last lecture we detailed the sort of early competition, early antagonisms between the Russians on the one hand and the Americans on the other. We looked at their relationship in the 19th century with their shared mutual enemy, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom frustrated American expansion in the West by extending Canada all the way to the Pacific. At the same time, the United States was extending their western boundaries to the Pacific. The two powers cooperated to a great extent, and they sort of defused the tension in North America. The Russians had extended from northern Eurasia into North America with claiming the Alaska territory on the far reaches of the North American landmass. They also set about creating or establishing the Russians set about also attempted to establish, I should say, a sphere of influence in Central Asia, but they were confronted by the British, who had established the British Raj, encompassing mostly modern-day Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, and they were seeking to extend their influence into Afghanistan. There were failed campaigns into Afghanistan, and also just through influence, extending their reach into Persia. Persia was sort of split into these spheres of influence between the Russians and the British on one hand. And then we also looked at the breakdown in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States after the war. With the death of Franklin Roosevelt, there was a reshuffling of the decks, of the political decks for both parties. Harry Truman, very much green to the job of national politics, did not have the negotiating skills that Roosevelt had, and he was also not respected by Stalin. Stalin did not have the reverence that he had for Roosevelt, that he had for Truman, and that really wasn't a great secret. The fact that they could not cooperate the way they had before meant that there would be new tensions and sort of breakdowns in communications between the two groups. There was also the policy of communism containment, which was meant to break really the Soviet Union, was meant to destroy communism by stifling it, by making sure that it cannot expand, by starving it. And that, of course, brought a new dimension to its antagonism. And where we last left off was the division of Europe into Eastern and Western zones. The Western zone under the influence of the United States, the Eastern zone under the influence of the Soviet Union, and of course Germany is divided between the two powers. And from there, I'd like to pick up by noting that, ironically, the United States Soviet Union Cold War gave Europe the longest period of general peace that it had known since the founding of the Spanish Empire, and that's going all the way back to the 16th century, to the 1500s and the reign of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Also remembered as Charles I of Spain. This peace resulted because neither side wanted a war, but the conflict between the two continued because their argument had become a global affair, and this really was just an ideological argument between the two superpowers. The demise of the old powers, in particular the colonial empires in Africa and Eastern Eurasia, led to hot wars, very very destructive hot wars. The civil war in China between the communists under Mao Zedong and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, almost immediately after the defeat of the Japanese, broke down or deteriorated relations even further. In 1949, Mao's forces won. And this had long been predicted by the United States State Department, but it sent shockwaves through the United States. Chiang Kai-shek was forced to flee mainland China for the island of Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. The loss of China became a highly charged issue for the United States. There was so much, it was so potent a force in American society at the time that the Republican Party used it to unseat the Democratic Party in the next election cycle. The loss of China also coincided with a new wave of anti-Soviet hysteria and the successful testing of a Soviet atomic bomb. So China's lost. The then dominant political party has lost to their rivals, and the Soviet Union is now atomic. That's the global setting heading into 1950. And in 1950, Mao went to Moscow to sign a treaty of alliance with Stalin. Also in 1950, the Korean Peninsula, which had been under joint Soviet/American occupation following the defeat of Japan back in 1945, both of the occupiers instituted rival governments in North Korea and in South Korea, which suited them fine, but not the Koreans themselves. Had the Koreans wanted to unify their homeland, they wanted one government in their homeland. Both sides threatened to unite their country through violence. On June 25th, 1950, with or without Stalin's blessings, the North invaded the South. North Korea invaded South Korea. Now, Truman and his administration interpreted this as an open Soviet move that could not/would not be tolerated or accepted. In a telling moment, Truman viewed the act as a mirror move to the 1936 Nazi occupation of the demilitarized zone along the French border. Truman, taking advantage of a Soviet boycott of the United Nations Security Council, and this boycott was over communist China, sought and received approval for a military invasion to halt the advancement of North Korean forces. This intervention, led by General Douglas MacArthur, stopped the North Korean forces. The United Nations peacekeeping forces stopped North Korean forces, and a surprising move. It was really the incident, the engagement that really stopped the advancement of the North Koreans with an amphibious landing at Incheon. The Truman administration then took advantage of the victory to push to unify the Korean Peninsula under the democratic government of the South Korea. MacArthur forces crossed the 38th parallel, which violated the original ordinance that orders that he had been given. He had been given just to stop the invasion, not to conquer the entire peninsula. But he crosses the 38th parallel, and that was the dividing line between the rival governments, between the rival protectorates. The United States action led to a massive mobilization in China. The Chinese saw what the United States and the United Nations was doing as a threat to their security. They were taken as a direct challenge, a direct threat to China. First, they undo the communist government in North Korea, and then they come and they undo the communist government in China proper. The Chinese quickly transformed the war into a major conflict with global potential, with global or world war type potential. Now, the Truman administration quickly reverted to the earlier aim of simply liberating South Korea. The United Nations forces forced their way back up the peninsula when MacArthur refused to accept this new policy and pressed for an expanded war that included taking the fight to China. He was relieved of his command with the backing of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Omar Bradley opined, he said, commenting on what MacArthur wanted to do and reality of the situation, he said to expand the war would be the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemy. Sort of hinting that fighting China was not an objective. Fighting in China was not an objective. The Chinese were not the enemy. And that any thought of war with China needed to be dismissed at once. The hostilities ended with an armistice in 1953. And 1953 was a pivotal year for the Cold War, as both the United States and the Soviet Union experienced leadership changes simultaneously. Dwight D. Eisenhower succeeded Harry Truman as President of the United States, and Nikita Khrushchev succeeded Joseph Stalin as General Secretary / First Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Khrushchev, upon taking office, denounced Stalin, and he began the process of reversing Stalin's more repressive policies while inaugurating a more liberal era in the Soviet Union. For a moment, there was a thaw in the Soviet-American relations when everything was intense, and the ramifications of this standoff was at its most heightened global was at its most highest level globally. They sort of took a step back, but everything would sort of flare up again as decolonization increased. During this time, India and Pakistan are becoming independent republics. Bangladesh is breaking off from Pakistan, is beginning the process of breaking off from Pakistan. Pakistan, once it was granted independence, was really comprised of what we now consider Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and Pakistan proper, Pakistan as we know it, was West Pakistan. And Pakistan is a sort of made-up name, not a made-up name, but a brand new name. It was all really India, all really part of Indian civilization. The only distinction between the two was that the region that became the Pakistans became home to the Muslims, the majority of the Muslims in the old British Raj, and India proper, India we know it, the Republic of India, became the home of the majority of the Hindu population there. So we sort of had that so we have sort of that dynamic going on there. Yeah, there's this liberal era, there's decolonialization, there's a change in leadership at the top, new leaders coming in with new philosophies, new ideas. Khrushchev is a much more open-handed, a much more liberal leader than Stalin, but very much committed to Soviet dominance, Soviet primacy. And the same with Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower coming in with not much of a political background. He's not a career politician the way that Truman or Roosevelt were career politicians. He was a career military man, and he's bringing a new dynamic, a new thinking to this problem, to this situation. Now the former colonies were new spheres of influence for the powers to compete over, as their behavior and thought patterns were being altered to court these new places. Now Khrushchev, in the United States, the Republican Party had to overcome breaking the Democrats' 20-year hold on the presidency by condemning communism and promising to be hard and vigilant towards that threat. The anti-communist hysteria was at its height. Both parties had learned that to be soft on communism was to court disaster. In the Soviet Union, the anti-American propaganda was in full swing. Khrushchev halted reforms and used force to put down a rebellion in Hungary. This event led to Soviet leaders to view reforms and change as detrimental to the stability of the regime. Its reforms, these liberal ideas, would be detrimental to the stability of the Soviet Union, to the long-term viability of the Soviet Union. Now, the Cold War continued and flared up regionally across the globe, except between the Soviets and the Americans, who were still in a stalemate and did nothing at all but stockpile weapons, nuclear weapons at that, to maintain a balance of power. And really, they weren't even maintaining a balance of power. They were maintaining a balance of terror, because you don't need all those weapons in a nuclear war. You're just creating more and more to terrorize your opponents. Now, by the late 1960s and 70s, the peace had been maintained, but the binary world of the early period was slowly beginning to change. New centers of powers. New centers of power began to emerge as Europe recovered. China emerged as the major player, and the former colonies began to develop. The split between Russia and China became so intense at this time that President Nixon, Dick Nixon, who came into power in 1968, sensing the limits of American power in Vietnam and the possibilities of the split between China and Russia, decided to pursue a triangular approach to the balance of power that led to a major lessening of the global tension. Nixon sold his policy of détente with China because of its reputation as a Cold War hardliner. Going all the way back to 1946, Nixon came into Congress as a communist hardliner. He won elected to the Senate as a communist hardliner, and he was picked up at the running mate for Eisenhower, because he was a communist hardliner. He had built this large career on being hard on communism, so if anybody could sell détente, it would be Nixon. Only Nixon could have gotten détente. Anyone else would have been compromised almost immediately. But Nixon sold it. It appeared that the Cold War was coming to a close, but it flared up again with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in the late 1970s. To prevent the collapse of its friendly government in Afghanistan by Islamic fundamentalists. That was the rationale, the motivation for intervening in Afghanistan. The government there in Afghanistan was friendly, it was cooperative with the Soviet Union, but it was also being threatened by Islamic fundamentalists. It was in danger of collapse, much the same way that NGO's government in South Vietnam was threatened by the Buddhist majority, and never really had any sort of legs of his own to stand on. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, on the heels almost of the Afghan wars and the Iranian Revolution, they all were sort of harbingers of things to come that threatened both superpowers, who remained locked in their own struggle. Carter and Reagan, who served and Reagan and Carter, they both served as president during the duration of the Soviet-Afghan Revolution war, and the Iranian Revolution. Carter served during the revolution, and Reagan was president during the formation of the new theocratic Iran. They both condemned the war and they supported the Islamic forces. But Reagan went further. Reagan condemned détente, and he created a more heated atmosphere. Really, what we see with Reagan is the return of brinkmanship politics. Brinkmanship was devised in the 1950s to sort of bring a quick resolution to the war. It fell out, and it was not revived by. It was not picked up again by Kennedy or Johnson or Nixon or Carter or Ford, for that matter. But Nixon brings it back. No, Reagan brings it back. Sorry, and Reagan pushes this new brinkmanship, this condemning of détente, and sort of pushing the atmosphere, sort of pushing the envelope. The antagonism and the fraught international conditions created by Reagan not only generally remembered. Are not generally remembered because of the way the decade ended. Many people thought that they were on the brink of World War III during the 1980s. The Soviets shot down a South Korean airliner. The arms race accelerated. Reagan pursued the Star Wars program, and the Soviets had to respond to that. The strategies were revised to illustrate how a nuclear war could be won. World War III did not occur, thankfully, primarily because the old Soviet leadership had died off. We still had, in the United States, we still had a couple of dinosaurs kicking around, pushing for Star Wars and pushing for a heated, nuclear resolution to everything. The new generation of Soviet leaders instituted major reforms, and Mikhail Gorbachev sort of takes center. He does take center stage in this new Soviet cadre to come in and to initiate better reforms. And these reforms are characterized by the terms glasnost and perestroika. Reagan's decision to embrace the reforms Gorbachev put in place helped to end the Cold War. But the reforms themselves led to the independence of the Soviet satellite states and then the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party in Russia itself. So now the Cold War was not a war. Most people tend to think that it was a Cold War, that it was fought in some sort of cold region, that we call it the Cold War because we fought against Russia, and Russia's supposed to be a land of snow, a very cold place. It wasn't a war. No war ever erupted during this 45 year period between the United States and the Soviet Union. What the Cold War was a heightened and prolonged state of international tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that could have, but never did, descend into violence between the two powers. The Soviet Union and the United States Cold War was punctuated by regional wars. Korea was a major regional war. China was a regional war. Vietnam, Afghanistan, the invasion of Grenada, those were regional wars. Regional actions, the Cuban standoff, the Greek and Turkish missiles that the United States put into missile launch pads that the United States put into those nations. Those were regional conflicts, examples of regional wars. The conflict may have been inevitable, but not the intensity and duration. They resulted primarily from the domestic and ideological differences between the two powers. The Cold War could have ended with atomic stalemate in 1949 or the Korean stalemate of 1943. Hysteria on both sides prevented that. The loss of American lives in the mission to stop the spread of communism also led to a retrenchment in the United States. In the United States, no politician would advocate for a soft policy on communism due to electoral fears. Khrushchev's successors reversed all anti-Stalin reforms out of fears that they would lose control over the buffer states. And in their reaction, they restricted their contact with the United States for fear that it would upset things at home. A united communist bloc also never really existed. The communist governments of Eastern Europe were either totally under Moscow's control or closely supervised by Moscow. That was about as united as the communist regimes ever got. Cuba wasn't under the thumb of Moscow. There were a lot of things that came along with this communist deal that Fidel Castro would have bridled at under or just played dumb at. In Ethiopia, the communist regime in Ethiopia was never completely under the control, never under the complete guidance of Moscow. Vietnam definitely wasn't under the complete guidance of Moscow. China broke almost immediately with Moscow over regional matters. And the same is true with North Korea. So there was never really a pan or globally united communist bloc dedicated to overthrowing democracies and capitalism the way there was in the West, in which the United States bred this idea and really formulated these alliances to overthrow and destroy communism globally. So, and just to sort of underscore it, the communist governments around the world, they separately pursued different variants of communism. A very real example of this would be the way that the Cuban leader Fidel Castro instituted communism, the way Mao instituted communism, and the way that the Derg instituted communism in Ethiopia. And these are all contrasted with Soviet brand communism. Now, the real threat to the United States was not really from communism, but rather the implications of Soviet Union expansion and power and the power vacuum that existed in the New World. George Marshall, George Kennan, Dwight Eisenhower all saw the signs and warned of the dangers of becoming a garrison state while recognizing the limits of American power to combat the Soviets. Containment was designed as a non-military, limited economic policy for Europe, but the narrowness of the policy changed as the two superpowers contested one another in regions around the globe, hoping to defeat the other while expanding their influence. This led to the growth of containment and the militarization of containment in spite of the continued objections of one's opponents. Containment remained the policy under every president from Truman through Bush Sr., albeit with different strategies. Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and her satellite states in Eastern Europe, on the heels of the Reagan administration, and because of this tough stance that he projected, it's normally and typically assumed that he won the Cold War, and he did not. And with that, we'll end with our analysis here, and we'll come back with the remaining half of the Bush administration. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.